I always like to make sure that we take an opportunity to formally introduce our guest co-host. We want you to know their credentials, what kind of lens they're bringing to this conversation. This allows us to make sure that we understand that they're well qualified to be spending this space and time with us sharing. But equally important, this also allows us an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper once we get into our conversations. And so here is Rico Jacobs Chace official bio. Rico started his career as a diversity consultant following on from launching his radio show Against Racism in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement. The 9-part series explored the various forms of racism and how we can collectively make a difference. After reporting live at the Black Lives Matter protest and speaking in the award-winning Pride and Protest documentary, he was appointed as director of Transactual UK. On healthcare, he has also spoken on NHS King Cross Hospital panels and Northeast A&E doctors on LGBTQIA+ healthcare and a similar subject at the Mayor of London's roundtable think tanks. As a member of the board, he continues to strive to change UK legislation for trans and non-binary equality, tackling hate crime, and raises the Black queer intersectionality question in all forums through addressing audiences at the House of Commons, London's Trans Pride, Sony Music and the BPI Network, and Department of Transport conferences, with quotes in Forbes, Vice, and Pink News. As visibility matters, Rico has been the face of the most recent Copperfield and GAP campaign, GAP campaign, speaking live on their platform regarding the intersectional impact on members of the Black trans community. Rico is a very vocal activist fighting avidly for the rights of LGBTQIA+ people and Black people alike. So Intentional Conversations VodCast community, in your own way, provide some level of support and love to our guest co-host today for sharing space and time with us. We are so grateful you're here, Rico. As I often like to do, I want you to unmute yourself and greet this audience in your own way. And we want to know, what is your DEI story? What additional lens do you bring to this broad conversation outside of maybe what we've already been exposed to through your official credentials and accolades in your bio? Welcome, Rico. How are you today?
I will, thank you. I mean, you read my credentials and I've made you feel very, very uncomfortable. I'm not gonna lie.
It makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but look, we got to share all that goodness. Yes, and so we appreciate you.
That. I appreciate
So we can
that.
bring it down now. You can tell us some other things that we won't find in your bio that you think are just equally important for shaping who you are.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I always try and take up space, take up opportunity to make sure when I am in a forum that I do it justice. So I don't really show up to a panel and not actually done my previous research. So when I was speaking at the Department of Transport, I did a survey in advance to sort of make sure that I don't just cover what I know from a sort of London-centric point of view, that I actually capture regional experiences, because you don't know what you don't know. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. But me, I mean, Rico Jacobs Chace, pronounce he, him. I'm a Black trans guy. And yeah, I sound pretty like an ordinary bloke, to be honest with you. I mean, I only realized that I was trans at the age of 25, and that's due to homophobia and transphobia, which was part of, unfortunately, the cultures that we grew up in. So in the UK, Section 28 effectively removed any mention of the LGBT curriculum from our curriculum, effectively. So I didn't grow up knowing about the LGBT community. A good example is in the UK, one of our favorite childhood books is Tracy Beaker. And if Tracy Beaker had mentioned one of the characters in that book, Cam, was a lesbian woman, then that book would have been off the shelves. I wouldn't have known about Tracy Beaker. I wouldn't have had like a Tracy Beaker rucksack growing up. That's how much impact that sort of censorship has had. So yeah, I mean, I came out as a trans guy at age 25. I'm 29 now, so I kind of just went from being a lesbian to trans person in like 0 to 100 real quick. And once you accept who you are, and you realize that being accountable only to yourself, there's a significantly large amount of freedom in that. And yeah, so that's how I got to writing today.
No, great. Well, thank you so much, Rico. Again, we're so honored that you're here and that you said yes to our invite. So let's jump right in. And by the way, tell us all where you're joining the conversation from today.
Yep, I'm based in Greenwich, which is in Southeast London.
Greenwich, Southeast London. Great, fantastic. So you started a career in asset management. So tell us a little bit about your why in DEI and what sparked that shift. You started to talk about that just a moment ago as you were sharing, but I want you to elaborate a little bit further for us, if you don't mind.
No, of course. I talk about it quite frequently. So I used to work in asset management on trading floors. And when I first arrived at the company, believe it or not, I actually looked like a girl, and I was potted in with my handbag on my arm. And I was wearing a dress and heels, because that's what's expected during an interview process. You have to look the part, quote unquote, the part. And the thing about the detriment of having a perfect society is that it implies that something is imperfect. When you strive for perfection, it means anything that is not quote unquote what you were expecting should be removed or is derogatory, etc. So I actually interviewed quite feminine, and I actually was quite non-binary in my presentation. In the previous financial company I used to work on, they used to kind of like tease me a little bit about it, because one day I'd come in quite feminine, and the next day I'd be in a polo shirt and I'd be like slouching in my chair. But no one really cared, because as long as you got your job done, didn't really matter at all. And that was the beauty of it. That was the beauty of the industry.
We have to stop here for a second. I need you to say that again. As long as you're getting your job done, that's the beauty of it. That's what counts. That's what matters, right? So I just had to amplify that. Carry on.
It's okay. You're hired to do a job. You're not hired to re-educate other members of staff. Like, that's not really what I came to work to do today. And yeah, unfortunately, because I was more than binary presentation, they perceived that as me letting myself go. I had hairy legs. I always had hairy legs as a kid, and it used to drive me up the wall when I was swimming, because I like to be the hairy kid. But then I realized, actually, I quite like my hairy legs. Like, what's the problem with this? And I'd never met trans non-binary people at that time, but I knew myself who I was, and that was the conflict. And the more I went against the grain of what the expectations were in the office, the more I ended up being considered rebellious, because I had like a massive afro. I don't know, like, this is my hair, I'm having it. Yeah, and I ended up getting bullied, unfortunately.
Was it as big as mine?
Yeah, it was. When I first came in, I saw your hair, I was like, like, that's maintenance right there. I like Pele. Yeah, that's the thing. Like, if people think that stereotypical like white presentation is what you should be looking for, anything that doesn't really align with that is considered unprofessional. Like, why is dreadlocks unprofessional? Hair is hair. So I mean, I was one of the first women on the trading floor. I was one of the first PhD people as well. I had people coming up to me asking me, is it cultural differences? I was just like, that is racist. But when you're the junior person, you can't really say. Diversity and inclusion at the lower end of the hiring hierarchy is not diversity and inclusion, because how's the intern supposed to tell the senior manager that they say something which is likely sexist, racist, or any of the other phobias? You don't really have that empowerment. Anyway, cut a long story short, I ended up being bullied for my identity. I refused to resign. Like, it will get better, and my ancestors were slaves. We survived anything. We can survive this, and that was my ideology. I ended up with post-traumatic stress disorder. So I went home after leaving the company, had a nap, woke up, and I had post-traumatic stress disorder. So like, people couldn't touch me for about an 8-month period. If you came near me, I would have a very, very severe panic attack. And I couldn't read, write, or eat in public settings. I had to literally reset everything. And I'm 3 years in to my recovery now. I mean, the thing is, before, ironically, I hated doing public speaking, and now I do public speaking for a living. There's just a lot of things that I realized that my entire identity was based on my job. When you say, oh, hey, how are you? It's like, oh, I'm in my Rico, I worked in finance, or I'm an accountant. What the person's actually asking you is who you are as a person. Like, what makes you tick? What are your hobbies? Like, our identity is very, very linked to our career, which in some ways beneficial, but it also means that if you do lose your job, you feel like you've lost part of your identity, which is quite, which isn't really good, to be honest. But so part of that, by not having any external pressure, I found who I was as a person, and now I'm quite comfortable who I am as a person. I'm like a proud Black trans guy, I'll sort of say that. speech at Parliament. I'm quite comfortable with who I am as a person, but I do realize that there's a certain element of privilege in that. If you are in the professional setting, do you say have to come? Do you feel comfortable transitioning? Do you feel as if people are going to respect your pronouns? There's just a lot there that kind of needs to be done, needs to be changed. So yeah, that's how I got into DNL.
No, I so appreciate you sharing that story, and I'm glad that you are feeling whole and empowered now, and you're able to to speak about it, and yeah, you're getting lots of love and support from this community as well. So what are some of the common misconceptions about mental health in the workplace, and how can we be better allies to the trans and non-binary community?
I think I'll split those two questions up. But when it comes to mental health in the workplace, I don't think any of us, well, I don't know about your curriculum, but my curriculum definitely didn't include any sort of anxiety, depression, tips and tricks. It didn't initially explain what it is, and more importantly, how to maintain your mental health. Like, I am fortunate to be part of a group and they do a lot of like mental health and well-being and meditation exercise. I didn't know any of that. Like, why did I not know any of that? Like, why is it the point in which you get support for anxiety and depression when you're at the breaking point, when you were like sort of, we'll call it, oh, they had a breakdown. Do you really need to get to that point? Be good if people know, okay, I have to have a rest day. And interestingly, a lot of cultures do actually have rest days in built. Sunday, you do nothing. A lot of religious groups do actually have that inbuilt. Meditation is part of being Buddhist, Hindu communities. They also have meditation. Christianity, what are you grateful for? Saying what you're grateful for. I'm grateful for this meal. A lot of that is part of old religious communities. I wouldn't say I'm politically religious. I'm probably more of an atheist. But just because we don't agree with everything in the past doesn't mean that we can't bring it into our daily practices today.
Right.
So,
yeah. So the reason that the question was kind of two-part, addressing mental health, but then also addressing allyship for the trans and non-binary community is because we know that those populations are often victims of systems of oppression, and so for those of us that are in this community and really want to stand in solidarity by providing a level of allyship, what are some of the suggestions and recommendations that you would share?
I would say a lot of people. It's a difficult one because it's effectively, if you're part of the LGBT community, you will have disproportionately large amounts of mental health. And that's not because of your gender identity or your sexuality. It's because of the sheer amount of hate crime,
Right. Exactly.
which you encounter. And unfortunately, we don't honestly understood by our families. We do experience disproportionate amounts of homelessness. Like, there's always a question mark: do you really want to tell your landlord that you're trans or non-binary? There's a lot there, and that does mean that we do have depression, anxiety, and unfortunately, that does lead to suicide. The life expectancy of Black trans women in the US is 35, and we don't even have statistics in the UK. So that's how much being part of the community will impact your mental health and your life expectancy. There's a whole raft of socioeconomic factors. If you think about it, I mean, in the UK we have NHS, but I wouldn't really get too excited when it comes to NHS trans healthcare. But if you are trying to survive, trying to pay bills, and you can't get a job because you're trans and non-binary, where does that leave you? If you can't sign a lease because you haven't got any income reserves, if you can't stay in a professional qualification or any qualification for long periods of time because you're afraid you're going to get transphobia or biphobia or homophobia from your professors, where does that leave you? It means that you end up stuck in a perpetual poverty.
No, that's real talk. And so we so appreciate this perspective that you're bringing. So what advice can you give to someone who is being marginalized, maybe in their workspace, for being who they are or dressing how they dress, again, for trying to be their authentic selves?
I would say that it's not up to one individual in a professional environment to change the work ethic or the culture of an entire organization.
Mm-hmm.
So don't put that upon yourself. I've spoken to a lot of trans and non-binary people in different industries, and their employers are asking them to sort of write a transition policy or to educate other members of staff. And I always say to them, that's not part of your paycheck. That's not part of your job description. You know, that changing company culture isn't up to you to do. They should have budget in order to sort of change company structures. So that's the first thing I would say. I would say that it's important that you feel comfortable coming to work with your full self. I'm aware that, especially in the 80s, covering a lot of people, if they was talking about their weekends, they'll say, oh, I spent time with my partner. They wouldn't mention the fact that they were part of the LGBT community. That's a personal choice. I fully understand that. I fully respect that. I mean, after what happened to me, I fully understand that you don't necessarily want to be that open about your identity, but it does eventually take its toll. So yeah, it's a toss up between, in some instances, a toss up between your career and actually being honest about your identity. And you just have to work out what the sweet spot is for you personally. But I would say that it is incredibly refreshing being in an environment where everyone does understand and respect each other. And a lot of corporations are trying to make a big impact or to effectively say that we are trans and non-binary friendly. So things are changing. I wouldn't say that they're changing quickly enough. But I would say that things are changing in the right direction. So if you're applying for a job and you see MX in the application form, that's a good sign. It means that someone's gotten there. If you look at the diversity of staff, even CAC, when it comes to on their website, that's another tick. You know, do they have a transition policy? Yeah, internally, that's another tick. You know, you can ask these questions in interviews, but if you are in the organization, you don't necessarily feel as if you're getting the traction that you deserve, then by all means, speak to HR. HR are there, and in the UK, you are protected by the Equality Act. So the Equality Act does protect you from any discrimination. So if you are experiencing discrimination, raise it as a red flag. But more importantly, what do you want out of the job? You're there to sort of get experience. You're there to improve your career, not to educate an organization. So if you can find a better opportunity somewhere else, I'll personally take it.
Yeah. So Rico, if you don't mind, tell us about what that breaking point was for you, because you have shared so far that you haven't always been as comfortable, you know, being able to share and talk very openly. But, you know, as you were giving advice, you said you have to just really identify, you know, what is going to allow you to show up as your authentic self. And sometimes those environments aren't supportive of that. So what was that breaking point and moment for you to where you were able to be victorious and say, no longer am I going to subject myself to not being able to be my authentic self?
I think I had to learn that, if I'm entirely honest with you, because even if you as an individual are fighting for your own rights, even subconsciously, if you're raised in an environment that told you that your identity is something which is taboo, you potentially may believe that. And I'm blessed in the settings that in the UK, we have UK Black Pride. I mean, we have a community, we have an active community. I remember as I was recovering from PTSD, I used to work as a bartender in a lesbian bar in London. And I used to always annoy my lesbian colleagues. It's like, you're not lesbian, you can't be this annoying. I'm like, yeah, because I'm like, you're not one of us. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm probably trans then. Because trans guys and lesbians, we're not the same. We're really not the same. I dropped so many dad jokes in the profession oh God, please Rico, please stop. Yeah, we're just there's a clear difference between the communities. We all enjoy each other's company, but we are different. But when I was working there, I luckily had a trans woman as a manager. And I said, oh, Rico, what's your pronouns? I said, well, I think I'm a trans guy. I think my pronouns are he, him. But don't worry about it. If you get it wrong, they're like, no, that's your identity. Your identity is important. People should respect your identity. And I was like, oh, really? They're like, yes. So I had the privilege of being in an environment where my identity was respected. And I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. Like I didn't just like wake up one morning and then have the confidence I had today. I was privileged that I had the people around me to support me on that journey. So your diet isn't just what you eat; it's the people that you hang out with. So always check.
Exactly. Yeah, your diet isn't just what you eat, it's people you hang out with. It's everything that you consume, right? Everything that you consume. So I appreciate that. So you're the director at Transsexual UK. Can you tell our audience a little bit more about the organization, the projects that you are affiliated with, and how it's impacting trans people living in the UK?
Of course. So Transaction UK was founded in 2017 after press transphobia. In 2020, we expanded significantly. I actually was brought on in 2020. We now cover, we run by trans people for trans people, and that what makes us quite unique in the UK space. Historically, a lot of trans-led projects were run by cishet, effectively lesbian, gay, bisexual people, which is nothing wrong with that. But when it's run by us, for us, that's not what's the Black Lives Matter movement. It does make a significant difference. So we cover legislative reform, media relations, and healthcare. So in the healthcare segment, we pull together a report, a presentation for trans and non-binary people, so they have like a workshop, they could come along and we could discuss what their legal rights were, how to have those discussions with medical professionals. We also pull together, I say we, I basically mean my very, very smart colleagues. They do most of that, I do most of the media relations.
Entourage, your colleagues, yes, we get it.
Exactly, no, they're amazing people. So they pull together a guide for GPs. So if a GP doesn't necessarily understand what trans healthcare they can offer a trans non-binary person, because GPs aren't actually given any education. It's not part of their standard curriculum, and it's not actually an optional module in the UK. So they have to literally work out what to do in the 10 minutes that the GP has with the patient, and that's just not always possible. Yeah, I got referred on to a erectile dysfunction clinic when I first spoke to my GP, and I was just like, this probably isn't the place for me. So they just make so many mistakes. So yeah, so that crib sheet was effectively given, was created by GPs, volunteer GPs for other GPs. Legislative reform, we write submissions. So my colleagues wrote one to the UN recently, violence against women and girls. We are part of the ban conversion therapy sort of working groups. So we do a lot of in that space, and LGBT Consortium is another great organization, pull together recommendations to trans and non-binary people in the UK, and that went to the mayor's office. So we do a lot on the sort of legal space, and media relations, things like this, just raising awareness.
Yeah, sure. Sure. No, that's awesome. Thank you. And I don't know if anyone in this community is aware of a similar effort and initiative. I would imagine that the United States has something along those lines as well. Would love for you, if so, to drop it into the chat. And Rico, you may know of, what's happening here in the States as well. Anything comes to mind that's along the same lines as transsexual?
I can't think of a specific organization. Okay.
Yeah.
I would say that we probably know more about what's happening in Europe. I mean, I'm aware of the British setting, and I'm aware that there's a lot of transphobia, but I don't necessarily know of a specific organization that's sort of tackling it.
Got it. No, thank you. So you are a leading advocate for trans rights. Tell us about how generational differences are often misconceived. And so again, we're lots of intersecting identities sometimes that can shape how in which people interact and perceive others. And so let's talk about the generational differences and how they're misconceived relevant to trans population.
There you go. You've got trans equality.
Thanks, Vicky.
Intersectionality difference. No, so intergenerational differences. Yes, of course. So when I first joined the LGBT community, the perception was that it was a relatively new concept. A lot of people have that misinformation. It really isn't. Gender and sexuality, fluidity has always existed. Interestingly, it was removed during colonialism. So colonialism created a hierarchy, as I'm sure you all know, D&I professionals, when it comes to race relations, women's rights, and also the LGBT people. So anything that wasn't quote unquote productive, or would go at least back to that perfect ideology that we were discussing earlier, once you have a perfect society, anything that is imperfect needs to be removed effectively. And yeah, so there's a whole raft of gender diversity in Asian communities. So the Hijari in India, two-spirited people, Native Americans. There was a non-binary Egyptian pharaoh. Non-binary people were considered divine in tribes in Angola, and non-binary people were in the service of the gods in the temple of Artemis. So those are independent communities all over the world, and non-binary people and trans people living their best lives. So it takes the same way that a lot of our history has been erased, a lot of our communities has been erased. So knowing that my ancestors would actually be proud of me as a trans person is just a massive weight off my shoulders.
Yeah.
And I feel as if when people, especially in the UK, if you talk about colonialism and if you talk about Section 28, those are two moments where there's a large amount of misinformation. And it means that when you're having a conversation with someone about D&I, you're not saying, okay, I'm not blaming you for being a white person. I'm effectively saying that you don't know because the system has been rigged. I mean, you could talk about dystopia if you really want to be, that person. But effectively, there is a significant large amount of misinformation. So it's just a case of bringing people back to where we were before. And a societal reset. I like to call it a societal reset, just going back to where we were before. And just the acknowledgement that no one is better than anyone else, just all people.
Yeah. So I appreciate you bringing colonialism to the conversation and how it has affected the history of trans and non-binary people. So I mentioned when I was reading your official bio that Copperfield and Gap campaign, of which you've been affiliated. So for those that don't know, can you tell us what is the Copperfield and Gap campaign and what do they aim to achieve?
Of course. So Copperfield is a cancer charity. I think they're international, but I mean, yeah, they're quite well known in the UK. So they're a cancer charity, and one of the projects that one of my colleagues is working on, they run the first LGBT cancer charity, Live Through This. And the person that runs it's actually a non-binary person. So they had a working group working with Live Through This in order to make their cancer charity more inclusive, because cancer does impact everyone, but the language that you use in order to describe cancer could be more inclusive. So there was a consensus that you need to describe breast tissue because both men and women have breast tissue. But when it comes to diagrams, the diagrams that say need to explicitly be women's breasts, or does it necessarily just need to be more of a diagrammatic? So they decided on using gender neutral, like fruit. So like they have the fruit, and then the fruit explains, okay, this is a lump tissue, etc. And it's just chest checking. But it's chest checking which is more inclusive. So someone who is experiencing gender dysphoria has the opportunity in order to take care of themselves and not necessarily fall victim to a very, very life-changing disease. So part of that project, I was part of that working group, and then they mentioned that they needed someone to do the shoot, and I volunteered. So that's how I got into it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that campaign was just brilliant. Copperfield is really promoting diversity and inclusion. And one of my favorite moments is that they had a board, and I don't know how to say this. There was basically a mountains of boobs on the wall, and then there was a non-binary chest, a trans person chest, and I was there with the person who ran the campaign. I was like, oh my god! They're like, yes, diversity everywhere. It's brilliant.
No, I so appreciate that. We all are familiar that October is, Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And so we're just coming off of a month where I know there's probably was a lot of communication and outreach and ways to help generate greater awareness. And my church did a video to help educate on it. And one of the individuals that was speaking was a male, and he was talking about how what that felt like when he first got the diagnosis that, you have breast cancer. And so I appreciate you bringing this to the conversation, because sometimes we don't think about how are we speaking more inclusively about issues that impact more than just one, gender. And so, thank you. I have a visual in my head of the graphic you were describing. It sounds like it probably was quite maybe effective in bringing that point home. Okay, so we're going to shift in just a moment to take some questions from the audience. And again, I will invite you to place your questions either into the chat, but we also love when people are willing to unmute themselves and share their questions live, engaging with our co-host. And so we invite that as well. So be thinking about those questions. I'm going to ask a few more and then we'll turn it over to the group. So can you tell us the intersectionality of being Black and trans and living in the UK? Talk about all of those experiences.
Wow, what a question.
I know, yeah.
Well, since I transitioned, I realized that men actually have conversations with me. Before, it always had like kind of like a weird leery air to it, which I couldn't quite put my finger on. And now, like, men offer to help me. They're like, "Are you right, mate? You look a bit lost." I'm like, "Oh, I don't know where I'm going." Like, "Oh, let's go that way." That would never have happened before.
Yeah.
People don't interrupt me in the meetings anymore, which is very
Mm.
refreshing. I would say if you are wearing a dress and heels on public transport, people will just stare at you. And it seems like it's okay to just stare at people. As a guy, no one knows that you exist. Like, you can go through your day and no one will look at you. Like, you're very like there's some blissful element there. I would say as a Black person, I've realized that if I go to a store, security people do follow me around now, which was like an interesting addition to my life. Like, seriously, like, I'm not stealing anything. I come here literally every day. And I would say I went to get a COVID test and I got a bit lost on the way back into the hospital. And I had security guards like following me, like, "Where are you going?" I was just like, "Oh, I just came to get a COVID test." And then a white woman was following me. They let the white woman go. It's like, "Oh, she looks fine." I was just like, "Looks fine?" I'm literally dressed like an artist, like one of those flamboyant artists. Like, do I seriously look like I'm a threat to your loading bay? It's just that a lot of things have changed. And I think POC, trans and binary people, we see both sides of the spectrum. So we kind of understand the privileges and the discrimination. I would say as a trans guy, my life is significantly easier than being a trans woman, 100%. And mainly because I would say I'm privileged that I'm passable, as I look like the gender that I am. But male privilege is 100% a thing, 100% a thing. I just happen to be short, and apparently that's the thing that comes to dating. You have to be over 6 foot. That was a new thing as well, I discovered. So there's a lot of things in society that really just need to be changed.
No, I appreciate you sharing. So there's one question that's already surfaced, and so maybe others are thinking about questions they want to present. So this question is, what advice do you have for those struggling to feel empowered to have discussions with senior level colleagues that what they're saying or doing is offensive?
Sorry, just quickly back to the sexuality piece and just popped into my mind. So being part of two different diversity protective characteristics does have a detriment, especially when it comes to accessing non-trans specific healthcare in the UK. Transaction UK, we created a survey recently and we pushed for the largest amount of POC respondents ever. Usually have around about 8%. We kind of got it up to 20%, just trying to get it to be proportional to the actual community. And intersectionality has actually been improved in that survey. I'll put it in the chat towards the end. So when it comes to access to healthcare, access to opportunities, when it comes to income, there's a significant difference in income. Well, that's to be expected, to be honest with you. So when you are part of two minority groups, it does impact your livelihood and your opportunities. Yeah, I think someone mentioned that when it comes to being a trans woman, because and this is roughly, I'm paraphrasing here from the quote, it basically said that people come from Asian backgrounds and have more delicate features, so therefore they are more passable as a Black trans woman. So therefore, that's the reason why someone will experience transphobia when transitioning. This is a whole raft of things. So yeah, that community are a significant disadvantage. And I was raised in an environment where sex work was considered to be incredibly taboo and not spoken of. And having lived in the Black trans community, sex work is incredibly common. It's shockingly common. Because if you can't get a job to pay for your transition and your healthcare first waiting appointment is 5 years, what options do you have realistically?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just the state of play. So and when we were doing the submission for violence against women and girls, that government submission, we got quotes from sex workers to put into that submission, and it was such a gnarly report. Proofreading it was an absolute nightmare. But the one that really stuck out to me was a sex worker. I had client came in, tied her up, hate to trigger anyone, sorry, with cables. And the only reason why she survived was because one of her friends came in and hit the guy over the head with a baseball bat. They didn't report that because they thought that the police wouldn't prosecute, and they would humiliate them. Plus, being a sex worker in the UK is illegal. So that's 2 instances of potential discrimination. And therefore, we've done a lot of work transactional with domestic abuse shelters, so that trans women, when they're the most vulnerable, they can actually access domestic abuse shelters. So that's one of the things that we're working on. So there's a lot that needs to be done. Also, how many trans people have you seen in professional settings, realistically?
Yeah.
I want there to be a future of trans doctors, nurses, and accountants. That's what I want. So yeah, it needs to be done.
No, I appreciate you bringing the realism and helping us to get a little bit better proximate to those challenges of trans and non-binary people. I do believe that we don't talk about it enough. These individuals are certainly in our communities, they're in our workplaces, and quite honestly, maybe many of them are hiding the secret, if you will, because they are afraid of how they're going to be perceived. And so as I think about those statements, what advice would you have to organizational leaders from a standpoint of being proactive, not waiting for someone to then raise their hand and say, hey, I'm transitioning, or here's my circumstance, but just being proactive to make sure that the environment is such to where that that process is not as stressful and traumatizing for individuals. What advice would you have for those organizational leaders?
And the diversity inclusion training should be the first point of call. Everyone has nodding. Preaching to the converted, all DNI consultants, like, yes. But it should include trans and non-binary history in that, and also Black history. I mean, I don't understand why everyone thinks that we were just slaves and that's it. We were enslaved. It's different. Like, people should understand the history that's been removed from our curriculum in a professional setting, because it creates a certain amount of ignorance, and it's willful ignorance. And I find that incredibly frustrating. So I would say that should be a part of the induction material. It shouldn't be in a company for 5 or 6 months to encounter a non-binary person, not know how to use non-binary pronouns. I think that if you have a non-binary person, that individual should be protected. Part of that induction, the HR people should politely make them aware that if they do discriminate against that individual, there will be ramifications. And it will end up potentially using your position. I don't understand why it's sort of like a pat on the back, or he'll get better, or, you know, I think there was one instance where someone got misgendered continuously, and they said, well, she's going to retire in a couple of months, so it's okay. I was like, no, it's not okay. So yeah, people should be held accountable, because it is illegal.
Absolutely.
And it's not up to the person to endure that.
Yeah. So I'm going to invite the audience to share some questions, thoughts, and reflections. And I am particularly interested in if there's someone, a part of our VodCast community, that is with an organization that has had to navigate the complexity of what do we do now, because one of our colleagues has come forth and say they're going through a transition. Are we prepared for it? Or did your organization take more of a proactive approach and you were already ready to accommodate for what was needed in the work environment? So I'm just kind of curious as to anyone in our community would be willing to share some thoughts, reflections around that very specific question. And I see a hand raised. Let me find, it's Vicky.
Just quickly, that, so people tend to think about the internal individuals in the organization. What about your clients? Like, the younger generation are fully understanding of trans and non-binary and gender, sexuality and fluidity. So you need to be able to move with the times. So if you have a trans and non-binary client and you're trying to close a deal, and the person, the staff understand trans and non-binary people, your,
Yeah. Well,
you
yeah,
know,
not just your employees, but your other stakeholders that may, visit your facility that you may be interacting with. Absolutely. So let's take all of that into account. Thank you,
but sorry,
Rico.
Vicky, go for it.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Just great to see you express yourself so comfortably and authentically. I actually have a transgender brother, so I have a personal experience, and he is a doctor. So I think you'd be very happy to see the representation there. Our organization was not prepared for a transgender employee, but I'm very, very grateful that we responded. I prefer if we were more proactive, but we did respond very well with establishing policies, making sure that she felt comfortable. But I want to make sure that we continue to look at that, because that happened in the middle of the pandemic. And we want to make sure that when we have a return to office, that she feels equally as comfortable in the environment. We did have some training. We had the policies. We had a thought leader in the industry who is also transgender, so that there was some more exposure to that experience. So there's more empathy that's introduced there. But I think it needs to be a continual conversation to make sure that everybody embraces and accepts her experience, her pronouns, everything about her, as we come back to a return to office environment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing, Vicky. I am keenly aware that the pandemic, certainly when you are being exposed to this information during a pandemic, trying to solve for that is even more complex. And so kudos to you and your organization for navigating that, and then continuing to keep it top of mind, knowing that as people then begin to gravitate back towards all being in the same facility, that we may have to remind people, re-educate people, reacquaint them to these are some things you have to hold in mind in the consideration set to make sure all of our colleagues feel a sense of acceptance and belonging in the workplace. And so thank you for sharing. Is there anyone else a part of this community that maybe your organization has had to navigate this, and you're willing to share some thoughts and reflections with us, whether it's lessons learned, best practices? I think we can learn from both.
I would say, well, just coming to mind, adding pronouns and bios.
Of course, yeah.
Is just like a minimum requirement, because it means that I don't necessarily need to out myself continuously. It's a safe environment. And I think I've had lots cishet people say to me, is it offensive? I'm like, no, it's helpful, because it means that it just standardizes it. Gender neutral bathrooms, if you can. Some trans men have periods, so having sanitary products in both bathrooms can be quite helpful, but realistically gender neutral bathrooms is just beneficial.
Right.
Having the training people to be aware that if they do misgender someone, that not to make like a massive deal out of it, just apologize and just say, oh, sorry, I'll do better next time, and just sort of move on, because it kind of makes it a bigger deal than it really needs to. I would say, yeah, transition policies in the office is a big win, and amending the dress codes.
Yeah.
Dress codes effectively say bring your full self to work or dress for your day. Is just like full stop. That's all you really need to be in it.
Full stop. Yeah.
Because gender expression isn't exclusive for trans and non-binary people or part of the LGBT community. Technically, there is no rules to it, and there really shouldn't be any rules to it. So if someone who is a straight man wants to wear eyeliner or wear foundation, there technically shouldn't be a rule against that. Right. People tend to think that we're just fighting for ourselves. We're basically fighting for everyone.
Yeah.
And we tend to think that being part of the drag king community, and that's just part of performing and showmanship. Realistically, that's not always the case. Gender expression can extend to people on the street. You can wear makeup if you want to.
Yeah. No, thank you, Rico. Those are some really good suggestions. So I see that Sam's hand is raised. So I'm going to I'm going to pin you so that you can unmute yourself and come forth with the conversation. Join us.
Hello. I have to say I'm a little anxious. It's the first time I've talked in front of the group, so thank you for allowing me the feelings of anxiety. um, I would just say that first of all, thank you, Rico, for putting yourself out there and again talking so authentically about your experience. I had a moment where I was tearing up because it was resonating with a lot inside of me. So thank you so much for sharing your story. It's really appreciated. As to Nika's question, thank you for that and about the workplace. I think it's extremely important for like to teach people to teach people how to acknowledge it, because what had happened in our workplaces, we have a predominantly white female work environment where I'm at, and we had somebody who came in who happened to be non-binary and used they them pronouns, and they were constantly misgendered, and people didn't correct the people who were getting it wrong. They didn't understand why it was so wrong, and it was hard for that person. It was hard, and I recognize like I wasn't perfect in that situation either, but as an ally I could have advocated a bit more and helped. And then I since learned that I am myself non-binary after like a lot of my re-education for myself, and I think that teaching people is really the key, because they don't understand until they can have some empathy and really digest that, because they're not going to see that what they're doing is wrong. And it took probably another 2 years for people to start putting pronouns into their signature blocks. But now a lot of my coworkers are, which is amazing. But it does take time, and I kind of hate the saying, but it does get better. Like I think it's true, but I think it's like unfortunate that we have to be the ones to really put our energy out there to make it happen. So thank you.
Of course. No, thank you so much for sharing, Sam. I really appreciate that. So there's some good stuff happening into the chat. So I want to make sure that we all are directing our attention there. And specifically, I saw where there was a question earlier from Ann Kingston. And it was about using, and Anne, I'm going to assume that because you placed it into chat, that maybe you prefer not to come live. I'm trying to get back there because it was really good. Has anyone found a good way to add pronouns to Microsoft Outlook or Teams? And it sounds like, at least from reading the chat, the suggestion was to add it into your signature. That's one place where you can include your pronouns. But yeah, I'm with you, Anne. I love the fact that I know Instagram and LinkedIn have automatically built it in. And I think that that's a good modeling, because we don't have to have these workarounds. It almost says this is natural occurrence, and it normalizes it. So I really do appreciate those organizations kind of taking the lead there. Are there any others that we know of that have been very intentional about making this just a way of life, a way of how in which we speak and communicate and introduce ourselves, besides like a LinkedIn? Any others that come to mind from this community?
I'll just add that I just was updating my Zoom profile because I wanted it to say Sam, and I noticed that they added a section that says your pronouns and when do you want it to show. So I thought that was really cool.
You know what? And that must be new, because we've always kind of just manually added ours to our name. And so now, so you see, this is how it happens, y'all. This is how it happens. You have a certain subset of people that will raise their hand and be willing to go there with this new idea. And then people start catching on. And then after a while, it becomes a bit more normalized. And I amplify that, because for those of us who feel like maybe these small acts of allying, showing forth allyship, is not doing anything, I guarantee you that collectively it is making a difference. And so
it makes a big difference. Okay. If I get an email from someone that doesn't have pronouns in it, I always think,
yeah.
It shows it's a safe space, basically. Yeah. It makes a massive difference.
No, absolutely. So Anne has a question. Would love to hear more on how you've conducted training for HMs and hiring managers and recruiters. And actually, this question is for someone in our community, I believe. I was thinking this was a question for you, Rico. It's for Finesse, George. You willing to share with us?
Hi, everybody. So I'm not able to be on camera right now.
Hi.
This discussion, one thing our team started to do is to begin educating our recruiters on the importance of using pronouns in all interactions with applicants or candidates or even finalists. And we've asked them to not only understand pronouns, but to really begin to appreciate it. One of the ways we framed it is, are your pronouns up for negotiation or debate or for someone's interpretation? Probably not. So we don't want to do that to anyone else. And that education has really gone a long way. It's a process though, right? Like not everyone is going to get it right the first time, but it's something that we've begun to do. We also put together like a 4-page kind of guide on how to use pronouns, conversation scenarios, and we're actually working on a video that we're going to distribute to our entire community. And we ask recruiters to also share the pronouns of every candidate that they're forwarding to a hiring manager in their emails. So that way the hiring manager knows before they are even meeting with the candidate what their pronouns are. And we ask the hiring managers to still ask, just in case something is lost in translation, to still ask that. So at every point in the process, people coming in or experiencing our organization are aware that we acknowledge pronouns.
I so love that. That is really, really good. That's really good. Thank you so much for sharing. Those are some great suggestions. And Sam, is your hand still up from before, or would you like to share again? Happy to have you share again.
I just looked at the time, so I'll make it really quick.
No, you're fine. Go for it.
One of the discussions that we've had in our workplace is that our nation is just so big, and that there are pockets where it might not be safe for people to be out. And we've had this larger discussion on why even cisgender people should have their pronouns out, but there still might be situations where it might not be safe to do that. And so I just thought it would be important to vocalize to the group that being aware of the situation that you're in and who you're around is also very important.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for bringing that to the conversation. Rico, seems like you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, that's a really important point. If I'm out and about, if I'm out with my friends, I'm just a guy. Trans men are men, trans women are women. Don't mention someone's trans in a public setting, because it's no, you don't need to talk about your medical history. It's not appropriate to talk about medical history in a public setting. Plus, it's not always safe. So yeah. But the best way to ask someone their pronouns is to sort of introduce, my name is Rico Chace, what's your name? My name is Rico Chace, my pronouns are he, and what's your name? And then that just kind of like invites the person to share. They may not want to share, and that's perfectly fine. Another suggestion I would say is to have hiring targets for trans and non-binary people within the organization, because that is like a commitment to actively invite people in the organization to be open about who they are. But more importantly, it's a statement to try and make a difference, to actually keep things, well, proportional, diverse. I don't think I've ever walked into a professional organization where I've actually seen the diversity match a public transport bus or train. It never does. And that means that something definitely is wrong there. If it doesn't look like a train or a bus, you got it wrong.
Yeah. If it doesn't look like a train or a bus, you got it wrong. You got some work to do. No, so I so appreciate this conversation. We're getting to the top of the hour, but I do want to thank you, Rico. I want to thank you for showing up as your authentic self and helping us to understand better about the challenges of the trans and the non-binary community. Thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for the work that you're doing to help people to feel safe and accepted. And we just appreciate you saying yes to our invite. Lots of good stuff is happening in the chat as well. I hope that you will take a moment to be able to, after today's conversation, look through it and see some of the sentiments that people are sharing. Thank you to all of our audience members that join us week after week, and even those that are joining us for the first time today. We do appreciate it. We hope that you have a wonderful weekend ahead. Remember, we will not be here next Friday, but we will be back on November 19th with Chace Williams, and we look forward to seeing you then. I want to give you the final remarks. What would you like to close this out with, Rico?
Stay authentic.
Stay authentic. I love it. I love it. On that note, we're signing out. Thank you all so very much. Thanks for joining us for Intentional Conversations podcast.